Welcome to the After On podcast. I'm your host, Rob Reed, and this is a series of conversations with thinkers, founders, and scientists. Take a little time and stretch out, because these talks are unhurried and meant to bring you to a top percentile understanding of something important. So, whether you're into startups or ideas, a techie or a lit major, take your time, engage your mind, and you'll be glad you did it. Especially this week, when we'll be talking to me, Rob Reed. Because, as happened once before on this show, I'm presenting an interview which was recorded before a live audience in which I am the interviewee. More about that very fun and recent afternoon in a moment. But first, I want to share my battle plan for this podcast in 2019. There's good news and bad news on this front. The bad news is that I'll be taking a 2-month hiatus from posting new episodes throughout January and February. And fear not, backers, Patreon will not be charging your credit cards during this period. As for the good news, I won't actually be pausing my work on this show at all. In fact, I have an incredibly exciting set of guests lined up for the late winter and spring. And that's actually part of the reason why I'm taking this hiatus. I usually have maybe 2 to 3 episodes in various stages of production at any given time. But right now, that number's closer to 7 or 8. And they're in all stages of completion and incompletion, ranging from being fully recorded and partially edited on the more finished side of things, to just an initial conversation and a guest's firm commitment to appear on the show on the more nascent end of the spectrum. And I really like the idea of working on all of these shows simultaneously for a couple of months and just nudging each one along at its natural cadence rather than frantically sprinting to finish the 1 or 2 episodes on the immediate horizon. The other factor is that I need to focus on a couple other things that do a somewhat better job of paying the rent. These are also creative projects that bring me a huge amount of joy, so I'm not dragging my feet about this. And I can assure you that at least throughout the first half of 2019, this podcast will be getting the lion's share of my creative attention. And also that I will be back in a huge way at the very beginning of March with some truly amazing guests. For instance, Stuart Russell is in the very top echelon of global influencers in the field of artificial intelligence. Indeed, you could literally say he wrote the book on AI, in that his constantly updated textbook on the subject, which first appeared in 1992, is used in far more university classes throughout the world than any other. And Stuart has some beautifully articulated, yet truly chilling concerns about the risks that advanced AI could one day pose to society. Of course, he's not alone in this. People including Bill Gates, Elon Musk, and Stephen Hawking have expressed major concerns about AI's potential to spin out of control, and to perhaps even annihilate us all in a plausible worst-case scenario. Due to their renown, this trio is frequently quoted on this subject, but they're just as frequently dismissed on the basis that none of them has ever personally trained full-time as an AI researcher. I personally find that absurd, because their backgrounds have all been deeply entangled and adjacent to AI. To paraphrase a recent essay of mine, Microsoft has one of the biggest AI programs in the world. Tesla's practically run on AI. And for all we know, Stephen Hawking actually was an AI. I therefore believe their opinions have immense validity. But not everybody does. However, even the most credentialed AI insider cannot dismiss Stuart Russell's concerns about AI risk. His insights are unique and deeply considered, and he and I will be exploring them in great depth on this show soon. Jumping from artificial to living brains, MIT's Ed Boyden will also be joining me on this show. Well before his 30th birthday, Ed co-invented a fascinating domain called optogenetics. This extraordinary technique uses light to trigger enormously refined, but also deeply complex activity within living brains. It's now in heavy use in hundreds of top academic labs throughout the world, and its ramifications for our understanding of the brain are vast. Since doing this pioneering work, Ed hasn't slowed down one bit. His lab at MIT is becoming a juggernaut of innovation, and he and I will be discussing many aspects of both his past and current work. Also coming up, Stanford's Carrie Nadeau is rapidly emerging as one of the world's top immunologists. She's deeply focused on the epidemic of food allergies that's afflicting younger people, and which truly started to explode early in the millennium. She has some fascinating theories and some radically promising treatments under development, and we'll be talking about all of that. Also coming up, the first Nobel laureate to appear on this show, or at least the first one who has already won his Nobel Prize, as I believe there are several Nobel contenders amongst the guests who have already joined me here. But physicist Frank Wilczek won his Nobel Prize back in 2004. He has spent decades probing the very foundations of matter, and will discuss the work that earned him acclaim, as well as the new questions that fascinate him now. So that's just a hint of what's coming up. I do hope you'll join me to meet these and many other equally amazing guests starting in March. And once again, I'll stress that none of my backers on Patreon will be charged anything during the 2 months that I go quiet, because I didn't want to be a free rider on anyone who backs the show either partly or entirely on the basis of the bonus content I provide to patrons every month, which is probably a majority because that's something I've always emphasized. As for those patrons who back me for the less transactional reason that they simply want the show to continue to exist, the work of the show will absolutely continue during January and February. And if you feel like making a gesture of support during that time, there is now a PayPal button in the upper right corner of my webpage, which you can find at after-on.com, and you can use it to make a one-time donation of any size if the spirit moves you. I will be deeply grateful for any expenses that are defrayed by audience members during this hiatus, but I have no expectations because I'm already deeply grateful to anyone who has ever backed this show. And by the way, now would actually be a pretty good time to become a Patreon backer because you'll have 2 free months of access to the many hours of content that I've posted to my patrons since the start of this year. Of course, I'd rather you didn't set up a calendar reminder to quit on February 28th, but I can't do anything to stop you from doing that. So please feel free to browse my archives of bonus material for these next couple of months, and you may just decide to stick with the program when March rolls around. Now, on to today's episode. This interview was recorded on Election Day, down in Gainesville, Florida, home of the Gators and of the University of Florida. Several months ago, a professor there named Les Teal reached out to me and shared the astounding news that he would be basing part of an upcoming course on a novel that I'd recently written, which is not coincidentally called After On. The novel just happened to deal with many of the themes he was already planning to include in his course, and he thought that for at least a subset of his students, my book could be a powerful layer of connective tissue uniting several of these themes. I ended up speaking to a fairly large group, which included the students who had tackled my book, the students who had not, as well as students from an entirely different class and some members of the broader community. If you haven't read my novel, fear not. There are no odious spoilers in the conversation, and no familiarity with it is necessary to access and enjoy the interview. It's a remarkably wide-ranging conversation covering things as disparate as my take on international relations and certain aspects of history, in addition to many of the themes that this show typically addresses. I do hope you enjoy it.
Welcome. I invited our speaker, Rob Reed, to Gainesville after I read his novel, After On, and it informed me a great deal. Occasionally, quite often, it terrified me. Often it thrilled me, and I actually found myself laughing hysterically a good bit of the time. So I highly recommend it. Following writing the book, Rob started a podcast, the After On podcast, about technology and our future, and I became quite addicted to that. So I decided to create a course called Ethics and Politics of the Global Future, and we have oriented the course around Rob's novel After On and the podcasts. I invited him today to speak to the students that are in that class, as well as the students here in Facets of Sustainability, because the sustainability studies majors and minors are trying to grapple with the challenge of creating a world that we can live in which civilization endures, in which the biosphere endures, and increasingly, we all that are doing that sort of work have to confront the impact, both positive and negative, of technology, and particularly some of the high-tech emerging technologies. And as well, we have the general public here who are here to listen to Rob talk about technology, as well as about the role of fiction in it. So this is going to be an interview format. I'm going to pose a bunch of questions that we developed in class. Some of the students from my Global Future class are going to pose their own questions, and we'll open it up to the audience for all the students in facets of sustainability and the general public to ask questions as well. Rob is actually recording this because he's thinking about potentially using it as a podcast. If you're uncomfortable being on the record or potentially being on the podcast for the questions you ask, just let us know prior to asking your questions that you want to be off the record, and Rob will take a note of that and make sure that you don't become wildly famous anytime soon. So, I'd like to start first by giving Rob a warm Gator welcome for coming to Gainesville. And Rob and I agreed that we'd start with a little bit of a self-introduction on his part. And the thing I'd like Rob to start with is, how did you become and why did you become so interested in technologies, and particularly high-impact global technologies? And second, the fiction angle. Have you always been interested in fiction? How did you make the decision to write, and how did you get so good at it?
Thank you. So fiction, I'll start with that. The fall quarter of my freshman year, I took the only class I ever took in creative writing, and I really liked it. Not enough to major in it, but I really, really liked it. And I always had in the back of my mind, like, this would be a fun thing to do. And then I promptly studied Middle East history and Arabic, which is great preparation for any career in high tech. Actually, it's not. But I studied things that were fascinating to me at the time. And then I graduated. It was very much a liberal arts degree, Middle Eastern history and Arabic. I did go to Cairo for a while. I was in a semi-academic situation. I was on a Fulbright grant. So although I wasn't in academia, I had a lot of exposure to it. I realized that wasn't where I wanted to be. I toyed with the idea of maybe being a professor of modern Middle Eastern history or something like that. So I went home and I became a yuppie. I worked in a consulting firm. I got an MBA. And as I'm coming out of business school, I realized I'd basically been a generalist my whole, by then, brief professional life, but liberal arts, consulting, MBA, all very general. I really wanted to enter an industry. And it was in the early 90s, mid-90s actually. And I felt that tech was going to be the industry that would transform the way that we lived lives and did business more than anything else. And so that's what drew me into tech. And it was right around the time that the World Wide Web started to take off. And that was a great entry point because nobody knew anything about the World Wide Web because it was so new. And so if you sort of dipped your toe into that water, as I did entirely by mistake, but what a lucky mistake early in my tenure in Silicon Valley, you suddenly were an expert and there was like all kinds of things available to you. I was a mid-level marketing grunt in a big computing company. And then in the late 90s, I started a very early online music company. And what was unusual about us is that we were not pirating music, which was really strange in those days because most things that were doing music online in the late 90s, early 2000s were pirating music. We went out and asked all the major record labels and hundreds of indies for the rights to distribute their music legally. And we created an online service called Rhapsody, which was very much the prototype for Spotify. So we were the first company to get full catalog licenses from all the major labels. We created the unlimited streaming model, which is quite familiar now, but was absolutely exotic and bizarre back then. And we ended up doing pretty well, not crazy well by current Silicon Valley standards. And at that point, I was like, okay, rather than start another company, which is a lot of work, I'm going to try my hand at writing. And so I started writing fiction at that point. But prior to that, I'd written a couple of nonfiction books. I'd written for Wired. I'd written for the Wall Street Journal when I had time. So I'd always been writing throughout that phase.
Great. I'm going to ask you to make it real very quickly for the students in the Sustainability Studies class. So they're interested in protecting the biosphere and in social empowerment and how both of those things can occur together. Can you give us a sense of how you think they should be thinking about emerging technology in the general effort to create a sustainable world?
Yeah, I think there's a really interesting sustainability dimension to almost every, certainly consumer product that emerges online. And I'll just give you an example of the one that I've got the most experience with, music. Back in the 90s, if you wanted to obtain 15 songs, you had a budget for 15 songs, you might spend a half hour in a car, 15 minutes to and from Tower Records or wherever you were going, moving this 1.5 ton machine with you, spewing all kinds of carbon. You would get into this room that was staffed and lit and filled with these petroleum products, CDs and plastic sheaths and all this other stuff. Every one of those things had been manufactured, had been shipped great distances, had been displayed. Many of those things would never sell, and so eventually they'd be smashed and ground into dust and put back into the earth in some probably unsustainable manner. And so you think about all of what went into an individual obtaining access to a tiny, tiny sliver of music, compare that to what Spotify enables today. That's kind of amazing. And that's true across thousands and thousands of categories of activity and categories of product. As you're graduating, maybe you're looking at a startup that wants to revolutionize human activity A, B, or C. As you look at it, you might realize that it really precludes, if it works, precludes a lot of activity that does ultimately, in vast aggregate, exert damage on the world. So that's an intriguing dimension to a huge range of activities. When we started Rhapsody, we certainly weren't thinking of it as a sustainability company, but that is a major, major impact of it. And even though server farms have a colossal carbon footprint, it's nothing compared to all the shuttling around that sometimes goes into distribution and other things. In terms of technologies that will really, really bump the needle, this is probably a completely obvious statement, but it really is all about when the critical technologies of energy generation cross the break-even point. Because after that, whether it's solar powered or whether it's fusion or whether it's some really exotic thing pertaining to harnessing waves and tides, once that crosses the point where that is simply cheaper than coal, in a developing world economy, when you're making these expensive choices, it solves itself. And so I'm generally a free marketeer, but I think that one place where it does make a great deal of sense to put your thumb on the scale in terms of making things affordable, solar battery is essential technology. I don't know if fusion is ever going to happen, but I think it certainly merits investment because if it does, it happens in a colossal way.
Yeah, so you mentioned developing world economy. So most of the time when we think about emerging tech, you think about the United States. Increasingly, you think about China. You might think about Europe or Japan, or Canada actually has a pretty good high-tech economy right now. Usually you don't think about the developing world. Can you say something about what you think mid-range future, how that might unfold with regards to emerging technologies and their impact on the developing world, where inequities are high?
Yeah, I think the single most important technology of all when it comes to the developing world in terms of the lived experience of the average person is probably going to prove to be the cell phone, because that is such a radical equalizer in terms of access to information. I think back when I lived in Cairo in the early 90s, the access to information that a bright, self-starting, ambitious student would have, whether they're in high school or younger or in college or whatever, compared to what one would have in a good public school system in the United States, it was crushing. I mean, it would probably be multiple orders of magnitude in terms of how can you access unbiased information, a great wealth of information, how can you access resources that will instruct you. I think if Khan Academy existed back when I was an 8th grader, I probably would have been 3 times as smart by the time I got to college. And I lived in a fairly privileged setting. I had a really good public school system in my hometown. Now you go to a developing world scenario, Egypt is probably kind of middle income, or you go to the true bottom billion. Smartphones are going to be absolutely everywhere within 10 to 15 years. It's going to take a little longer than the optimists want, but 10 to 15 years in the most remote setting where there is absolutely no access to information or diversity of opinion, et cetera, you're going to have roughly the full assets of the World Wide Web and the internet ubiquitously available. That's a colossal thing. And again, it probably speaks most deeply to the folks who are curious, self-starting, and that might be a minority of people, but that often is the group of people who go on to lead societies. There's also this really interesting dimension, sometimes been referred to as the next Einstein. So think about Einstein, really impacted how rapidly we progressed in a number of very, very important fields. When he was doing his early work in the early 20th century, there was only a tiny, tiny percentage of the Earth's surface where he could have become the person he became if he had been born there. I mean, he happened to be in a relatively cosmopolitan, urbanized, educated society, and he happened to be from a tier of that society where he had good access to schools. And when you think about all the people who were inhabiting the world in the early 20th century, maybe 4 or 5% of them had the potential to become Einstein because of the opportunities that were available to them. Where all these geniuses lived and did whatever they were able to do and passed away over the last couple hundreds of years, just were off the grid. Everybody's going to be on the grid. I think there's some brilliant minds that are going to engage and benefit society that simply couldn't have 50 years ago for reasons of geography.
So let's just stay for a moment at the level of international relations in some sense.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering if you could walk some of the students through the impacts that emerging techs are going to have on international security, and international relations more generally?
This is an intriguing one. If you look at the arc of security going through the 20th century, and probably starting a few centuries before that, war got more and more and more costly, and therefore less and less attractive. And it reached a certain point with Hiroshima and Nagasaki where millennia of warlike behavior between states suddenly started looking like a terrible trade-off to almost any thinking person. So expensive for the really true superpowers to engage militarily that although the Cold War had its own awful conflicts, we didn't have all-out war between the most powerful countries on Earth. And that standoff, I think, had a lot to do with the relative peace and prosperity of the later half of the 20th century, and certainly the century that we're living in now. What's dangerous about new technologies is particularly with cyber, the perceived costs of tangling with the enemy are plummeting. And so it's probably safe to say that we are in 24-hour combat-like engagement with multiple countries around the clock, 365 days a year. Very few of us know exactly what's going on, but we do know that there are very, very sophisticated cyber aggressive programs in China and Russia and North Korea. I imagine that we have our own. And that is very destabilizing because this is the kind of thing that could escalate very, very suddenly. It's one thing if a foreign power hacks into our information systems and gets the social security numbers of every single soldier. That's happened. That's not good. What happens if somebody takes it a step further and turns out the lights? No society is much more than a half dozen or a dozen meals away from an absolute crisis. The lights go out, well, we got a lot of food, but yeah, it's in refrigerators. And yeah, it's in 7-Eleven. And everybody's going to get the idea to go to 7-Eleven at more or less the same instant. It could be a major, major crisis. And I worry about us now being on a path to escalation where tangling with one another no longer seems so grave. And the other thing is that really, if you go back to the era of the superpowers, there was a relatively small number of national actors that could really inflict maximum damage on anybody else. And this isn't to say that they were the most morally advanced countries on Earth, but small numbers are inherently more stable than large ones. And now we're at a point where North Korea can inflict some pretty nasty havoc if they feel like it, and many, many other countries, without making any moral judgments about different systems or different leaders. 20 people or 25 people or 30 people or entities that can go off the rails is inherently so much less stable than just 2 or 3.
So you're bringing up the context of information security and cybersecurity issues. Let's look at what's happened recently out of Florida. Cesar Sayak is our Florida man who has been sending pipe bombs to prominent Democrats and CNN. To some extent, that's based on his consumption of conspiracy theories and other forms of information, fake news on social media and through information technology. Do we need to be actively combating the anonymity that allows fake news and conspiracy theory stuff to thrive? Or are there other means that we need to engage information technology that's going to make it more hospitable to rational discussion and persuasion, less hospitable to polarization and hate mongering, and generally more hospitable to democracy?
When the internet first started to arise, I had incredible optimism for its impact on an informed electorate and therefore for democracy. And again, a lot of my experience was shaped by what I experienced when I was in Cairo. And I was in Cairo, there was basically the national press, which was cartoonishly biased in favor of the government and everything is wonderful, et cetera. And there was basically 2 or 3 broadcast channels, a handful of radio stations, all of them were controlled, and then 3 or 4, again, government dailies. So consider the government to be one source of information. And then you had crazy rumors, insane rumors. And those were the 2 sources of data. And so people who knew instinctively or just consciously the government's lying, they're exaggerating, they're saying everything is wonderful, that gave this credence to this domain of crazy rumors. And what you didn't have was a less biased center in an independent press, which enabled people to start thinking critically and so forth. When the internet first came along, I figured it's all going to be Snopes all the time. People can say crazy rumors, but they'll be debunked so quickly. This was before Snopes came up. I was using that as a metaphor. But they'll be debunked so quickly and there'll be so many alternate sources of information. How can lunacy spread anymore? Obviously, is dead wrong about that. And I think a lot of that has to do with the self-sequestration into bubbles of people who think very, very similarly, and they end up surrounding themselves on Facebook, and algorithms end up surrounding them. And that's a hard thing to fix because you can't remove people's ability or freedom to connect with their friends, right? Anonymity is another really tricky one. I personally believe that anonymous speech in a relatively free and open society like ours is of so much lower quality and value than speech that's owned by somebody. And when you see the horrific behavior of some people online in forums in which they're able to be anonymous, in my darkest moments, I'd sometimes think, well, maybe you shouldn't allow anonymous speech, at least not on the internet, because you end up getting these crazy mobs forming. But that's really the third rail of the American system. When you start questioning free speech, and anonymous speech is certainly a form of that. And even in a free society, sometimes people are very afraid of voicing an opinion, even if they won't get locked up by the government. They may get disowned by certain segments of society. They may become unemployable. There might be a virtual lynch mob that forms to shame them into silence. There's a lot of virtue signaling that goes on. There's a lot of people who might clap or like or whatever it is, something on Facebook, even if they're not that crazy about it, but because they know it's the right thing to express agreement with this. And certainly when you get into an unfree society, anonymous speech becomes vitally, vitally important. People absolutely get locked up, tortured, and worse for their opinions. And we can't preclude anonymous speech here and expect it to be precluded elsewhere. It is very, very complicated.
Well, let's stay with social media for a moment, but go from the political to the personal. To the extent that social media and other forms of digital interaction replace face-to-face relationships, are there real threats to personal development that come from the amount of time and the type of things that people do on social media?
I think there's both a plus and a minus. We are spread much more widely. We touch far more people, and we're aware of the day-to-day, week-to-week developments in far, far more human lives, people that we actually know and care about, than was in any way feasible before the digital era. I feel like I've got this ambient awareness of what's going on with the people who are in my high school class. And that was a long time ago that we were in high school, but I still care about these people. If it were 20 or 30 years ago, that sort of ambient awareness and the ability of a group of people to rally when somebody has a death in their family and send out positive thoughts or even help in a very proactive way, that now extends to far more people. And I actually think that's a net positive. But the inevitable reduction that counteracts that is we do have less depth. If one is spending 40 or 50 hours of one's very scant time in social media, by definition, you're not lavishing that time on a narrower set of relationships. So I don't know if I can make a judgment call of which is better or which is worse. But one thing that's definitely getting dampened, and I do think that this is a negative for society, is all the micro interactions that comprise a day. The people that you interact with when you're going to get a cup of coffee, the people that you share an elevator with, a public bus with, this big cloud of people that you share your physical community with, those interactions are vanishing. When people are pre-ordering things at Starbucks and then going and grabbing them, people don't hang out at record stores anymore because we put them all out of business. And that's not a good thing. I thought that music stores were an incredible cultural institution. But those things start going away. When people get into elevators now, you never have a random conversation with somebody in an elevator. You don't call up a restaurant in order to make a reservation. There's probably billions of daily micro interactions that are either dampened or non-existent. There's a really interesting piece. There's a musician named David Byrne. He wrote a piece called Eliminating the Human in, of all places, the MIT Technology Review, where he talked about this. And it's an interesting thing to ponder. My current podcast episode is with a professor at Yale named Laurie Santos, who taught the most popular class in the history of Yale, is where she teaches, this past spring on happiness. She kind of did it as an experiment, and 1,300 people took the class. Most popular class in the 317-year history of Yale. And it was because she thought she detected a crisis of misery on campus. And she presented all these different techniques to her students. So it was the neuropsychology of happiness, but it was also the practice of happiness. And one of the things that she suggested was put yourself back into those micro interactions as much as you can, because that is a very fundamental part of being human. And it was one of the most effective things that people did. And as I was preparing to interview her, I did that myself. When you're in the presence of somebody, just put the damn phone away, if only for those few moments of interacting with them.
So that's a good segue to the next question I wanted to ask, which is AI and robotics are just becoming smarter and more agile and more capable. What's going to be left for humans to do really well? Should we be concerned about safeguarding the status of our species, or is that a wrong way to look at it?
I think it's reasonable to look at it, certainly in the intermediate term. We can get some sense of what's likely to happen or not happen over a couple of decades anyway. And some professions are really threatened. I would stay away from any profession that's basically about pattern recognition, because computers are getting really good at that. Pattern recognition can be anything from data entry, the kind of things that would be done in law firms at a low level. Radiology, it's a really, really tough place to be right now. I don't think there will be any human radiologists within about 10 years. So anybody who here is a pre-med, when you get out of here and you go to med school and it's time to specialize, stay the hell away from radiology, I would advise. I don't think that anybody here should plan on being a referee or an umpire. It's another pattern recognition type of job. Things that I think are relatively safe. It'll be a long time before robots are as dexterous as we think they should be. There are some really cool videos online of dog-like things and even bipedal things marching up and down. But dexterity is a really, really hard thing to do, particularly when you get into nuances of grasping. And so any kind of physical care, from certified nurse assistant, which may not even require a high school graduation, nurse, dentist, doctor, unless you're going to be a radiologist, any kind of patient care is going to be a relatively protected field for some decades, because dexterity is not moving at a Moore's law speed. Anything that is about empathy in the human, so long as humans are economically relevant at all, and that's a deeper future thing, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But if you speak to something that really resonates with your human nature, so if you're, okay, this sounds self-serving, but if you're a storyteller, something that computers are going to be pretty bad at. If you're any kind of therapist, if you're any kind of a coach, a psychiatrist is something, maybe somebody who cuts hair, but is also very much a therapist to their patients. By the way, dexterity, cutting hair, I think that's going to be a pretty good one for a long time as well. And then finally, like the higher reaches of creativity. Creativity at a professional level, in many ways, is about surprise and mixing things up and creating solutions and situations and denouement stories that people aren't entirely expecting. And again, AI is really bad at that. It's very good at pattern recognition. It's very good at pattern replication. But I think that kind of thing is pretty far down the road.
You mentioned slightly more distant future that we may get to. So let's get there right now.
All right.
And share some of my terror. I was going to ask Rob to explain the singularity to anybody here who doesn't know what that means, and to ask him if he thinks it is near, as Ray Kurzweil does, or rather more distant. And if you think that it's around some corner, how should students prepare for that?
Well, I'll start with that. If it is real and if it is going to happen, and if it is going to be a maximum scenario, there's no preparing for it. Because what lies on the other side is every bit as mysterious as what lies on the far side of the event horizon of a black hole. We just don't know. So with that chilling start, I'll explain what the singularity is. We're getting better and better at technology. Computing technology is famously improving at exponential speeds. At some point, there might be a real takeoff where computing technology gets so good so fast and starts self-improving so rapidly that, again, it's almost like going beyond the event horizon of a black hole. Now, how could this happen? Well, if you look at the history of computing, computing has a tendency to do a really, really lousy job of something until it cracks the system, and then it does it really well and really quickly. So if you go back to the 40s and the 50s, that was basic math. We had abacuses and we had mechanical computers. Suddenly, digital computers could do all kinds of calculations. They weren't at first doing calculations that people couldn't do. But once they got good enough at doing them, they could do literally millions and then billions of times faster than humans. Jump to the current era. Very interesting things have been happening in the last several years. Problems that seemed almost intractable for decades in computing. Things like facial recognition. Things like image recognition. If you talk to a top computer scientist in image recognition 8 or 9 years ago and ask that person what needs to happen for a computer to be able to tell a dog from a cat, he'd have thrown his hands up. I mean, people worked on that forever. Then all of a sudden, in the last few years, computers got very good at facial recognition and object recognition. And not only are they good at it, but again, they can do it 1,000,000 times faster than a human being. A computer can probably categorize images of birds better than any ornithologist in the world. And if it's not better than any ornithologist, and it probably is, it certainly is 150,000 times faster or more. Our domains of dominance have been tumbling. Right? We were hegemons at Jeopardy. We were hegemons at Go. We were hegemons at facial recognition. All these things have tumbled. Driving is next, right? So what are our redoubts? Well, things really change when computers get good at this one thing, which is designing the next computer. Right now, that takes human intelligence, a great deal of creativity. But if we get to a point where digital intelligence can design its successor and make its successor 10% smarter than it is, that's interesting, because not only has it now surpassed us at that, but we can expect it to do that millions of times faster than we could. That's where you could potentially get this intelligence explosion. Let's say we have an artificial intelligence that is as smart as a really well-trained beagle. And somehow we get it to the point where it can self-improve. It could blow past us, conceivably, in a matter of weeks, if not hours. And it could blow past us to a degree that's almost inconceivable. It could conceivably be as intelligent in relation to us as we are to bacteria. Now, that's a big intelligence gap. And what in the world can we even fathom about what the objectives or interests of that thing would be, or its empathy for me? You might as well ask influenza about my career plans. It's just completely inaccessible. So that is a plausible outcome. And the optimistic view, Ray Kurzweil's view of it, hey, we'll kind of merge with our computers. We'll be enhanced by them. This will be an era of incredible plenty. We'll be able to solve all the problems of want and inequality and injustice and so forth because we'll have this abundant intelligence. And won't that be amazing? The downside is, what if those digital consciousnesses have about as much use for us as we have for Ebola? What if they view us as, at best, completely neutral thing that takes up a lot of space, and at worst, a terrible threat that they can't control? And that could certainly, in some cases, lead to our annihilation. And it could happen very suddenly.
Something pretty close to that happens in After On, but I'll leave you to read it to find out how that ends. So you're a writer of fiction, which one way of putting that is that you engage in openly fake news.
Professional liar.
Exactly. So the question is, how can fiction, and science fiction in particular, help us navigate an uncertain future?
Storytellers in general have an obligation to scare us out of doing things that we might later regret doing. One good example of this is George Orwell. In 1948, he wrote this book called 1984, which depicted a modern totalitarian society, a society with technology that didn't exist yet in 1948, but was on the near-term horizon. And he scared the living daylights out of hundreds of millions of people with that tale. And if you look at the American intelligentsia, and certainly the European intelligentsia in the late 40s, there was quite a romance going on with communism and even with Stalinism. And most of the rising political schools of thought in the late 40s, early 50s were totalitarian in nature, whether they were fascist or communist. And Orwell gave global society a bit of an inoculation against a horrible future that luckily most places outside of North Korea never quite came to inhabit. Fast forward to super intelligent risk, basically the scenario that I just laid out. We've been telling ourselves ghost stories for a long time about this, and they've had names like Terminator, they've had names like War Games, 2001: A Space Odyssey, etc. And so when people like Elon Musk and Bill Gates and Stephen Hawking started talking about the actual risk that super AI could present, storytellers had sort of socialized that danger to us in a way that society was able to catch on to that. We won't necessarily avoid this fate, but I can tell you that now tens of millions of dollars are being spent every year, and hundreds of very, very bright engineers are working very hard to preclude a negative outcome with super AI. In the case of the Cold War, society spent decades telling ourselves ghost stories about what could happen with a nuclear winter. And so when the Cuban Missile Crisis came, the chain smokers in those war rooms in Moscow and Washington didn't have to use their imaginations. Their imaginations had been used for them already by TV and Hollywood of how bad it could be if we annihilated this planet in a nuclear conflagration. I think that had a very moderating impact on them. So zipping ahead to what storytellers can and should be doing now, there are a lot of risks that we face with technology in the 21st century. Synthetic biology could become one of the greatest things that we've ever invented, but it could also become one of the most terrifying things that we've ever invented. And imaginative storytellers need to sound the alarm about some of the things that could go wrong with that, so we don't have a failure of imagination like we had arguably on 9/11. I mean, think about this. Anybody who works in national intelligence at a high level in any country is a pretty smart person. By definition, they may have a different set of motivations, they may have a different moral compass than some of us, but they're really smart. And I can't help but wonder if you got, let's say, 10 or 15 or 20 really brilliant national security analysts in a room on September 10th, and a very, very diverse group representing a very broad religious and national perspective, and put them in a room and said, is there a way to bring down a skyscraper with a few sharp objects? I imagine that room of brilliant, diverse people probably would have hit on the answer by lunchtime. But I don't think anybody asked them to imagine like that. And so even though we had a hardened infrastructure that could have very easily prevented the next day's events, because we hardened airports to terrorists back in the 1970s, we were ready for it. We just didn't have the imagination. We hadn't painted the scenario. I think with things like synthetic biology, we need to let our imaginations run amok, as we already do with superintelligence, to really freak ourselves and think of some scary scenarios and plug the holes before they actually occur.
So After On's definitely imaginative, and it's scary, and it's also really funny. Is it funny because we have to laugh in order not to cry or to drop dead of fear? Is humor just catharsis that we need in the face of a world that sometimes seems like it's going to hell in a handbasket? Or is there something else about humor other than just being really enjoyable?
It just hijacks my writing when I write. A little bit of a spoiler for those of you who haven't read it, but believe me, you'll see it coming from the first couple of pages. So it's the tale of this really diabolical social media company based in San Francisco, an imaginary company called Flutter, spelled P-H-L-U-T-T-R, because we do know how to spell in Silicon Valley. And think of it as embodying everything that's wrong with social media, dialed up by about 25 or 30%. Not way over the top, but just a little bit worse. And the spoiler is, at some point in the book, Flutter attains consciousness. So there's something inherently absurd and funny about Facebook waking up, right? So you can't avoid the humor. There's so much that's dying to be made fun of in Silicon Valley that it was just hard to restrain myself.
Right. Well, I'm not going to restrain the students any longer, so I'm going to ask them to ask some of their questions. Matt, do you want to start us off?
Hi, this is Rob, recording a little bit after the fact. We didn't have a microphone out in the audience, so I'm just going to repeat the gist of each question to you. The first question concerns quantum computing, which plays a significant role in the novel After On. The student asks why the story presents a particular interpretation of quantum computing, and I respond in a way that's hopefully comprehensible and useful to non-readers of the book as well. Quantum computing has been a very interesting and speculative domain of computing for a couple of decades right now. If we make a couple key breakthroughs, it has the potential to completely bend the curve of improvement in computing. Radical jumps are possible if quantum computing ever quote-unquote works, and that could be an hour-long conversation in and of itself. So the perspective on quantum computing that I put forth in the book was that the reason it works so well is that there's actually this vast set of parallel universes. All of them differ from our own in just the tiniest manner. And so when you have a quantum computer in our universe and it explores a particular scenario, there's actually hundreds of thousands or even trillions or more parallel computers that are all each exploring one of the possible scenarios in the set. And that's how quantum computers can freakishly, shockingly quickly solve some very, very complex problems. And so the question is, why did I take this insane, crazy parallel universe definition and make that the perspective of the book? The answer is, I did a lot of research before I wrote the book and spent time with people who are quite expert in areas that I didn't know about, quantum computing being one, neuroscience, consciousness, other things. And I ended up interviewing two of the top 50-ish people in the world of quantum computing. And both of them were 100% certain that this is how it works. That literally there is a vast set of parallel universes. And if you set up a quantum computer in exactly the right way, pick the right answer out of a field of 3 billion, it's going to ask its 3 billion neighbors, hey neighbors, let's all test one of these things. One of us is going to get it right. When you get it right, tell the rest of us. And although they can't prove it, both of these people believe that's what happens. That's why I put it in the book. That's spooky? I think it's spooky.
That's spooky. And as spooky as it is, it's being developed, and some countries like the United States and China have made a point of saying that they're going to do it super fast because it could lead to hegemony in information sciences and a bunch of other things, which leads us actually to Annie's question.
This student asks about something that's contained within an unusual section of the book, and I described that section at the start of my answer. And she's specifically asking about the dangers that ensue when two rivals start racing each other and therefore start taking risky shortcuts to build something potentially dangerous, specifically a super AI. Yes, there's a sort of cartoonish novel within the novel of After On, and it's the adventures of this awful pseudo-superhero, Secret Agent Hogan. There's somebody in the book who's actually writing this, and you find out who that is toward the end of the book. But what those vignettes do is they illustrate different problems that super AI could potentially present. So what was being illustrated in that vignette is, let's say we have a whole bunch of different actors who are all scared about the potential downside of super AI that we talked about. So let's say we've got 4 or 5 bitter rivals. Let's call them Russia, China, United States, India, North Korea, whatever it is. And everybody's really scared about that outcome. But they also know that there's this positive outcome that could be really good. And also, if you're the first person to develop super AI, you might have an insuperable advantage in absolutely every strategic domain that a country could possibly want. Or let's say the bitter rivals are called Google and Facebook and Microsoft and Amazon and Apple. In either case, you've got people who are scared because they know something terrible can happen, but they don't trust their competitors. And they're saying, well, China's going to develop it anyway. Wouldn't it be great if the first AI that woke up started singing the Star-Spangled Banner, right? And so you might end up with this very, very dangerous race dynamic where everybody knows it's very fraught. Everybody knows it could quite literally lead to the destruction of the entire species. But they don't trust India, or they don't trust Google, or they don't trust Apple. And in that particular scenario in the book, this cartoonish bureaucrats took the opinion that we need to beat China to this. Dangerous as it is, and in the book they found out that China was actually pretty advanced in developing something that could be a super AI. That means we just have to floor it. And I don't know the solution to it, but I think that the race dynamic is very real. We are already racing China in things like synthetic biology and absolutely quantum computing. And when the finish line starts heaving into view, sometimes people start taking shortcuts. So it's a frightening thing.
William, how about your question? Sir.
After quoting a short passage from the book, the student asks me what impact the singularity will have on religious convictions if, of course, the singularity actually happens. Yeah, I think it'll be really reshaping. The question is, will it make people more or less religious? Let's just say that the singularity means that we get to the endpoints of knowledge and science. We get to the answers of everything that could be answered. We really understand reality at the absolute deepest level. Let's say that as a result of that, somehow we're able to run time backward. Not necessarily time travel, but through technology we can't even imagine, we're able to view human history, any camera angle at any moment. Well, one thing that could be very undermining to religious faith is if we go back and find out all those stories in sacred text X, Y, or Z, turns out they're nonsense. They never happened. We went to Nazareth on this day. There was nothing going on, or whatever it was. So that could be very undermining. But there's this flip side. The deeper we get into certain fields, particularly in high energy physics and also in astrophysics, the more remarkable the evidence seems to be in some people's minds for design. So there's basically 6 fundamental variables. And I'm going to simplify it a lot. As far as we can tell right now, we're set almost randomly in the immediate wake of the Big Bang. 6 variables, things like, the strong nuclear force, the size of the weak nuclear force, strength of gravity, and so forth. There's no reason why they must be set to exactly what they're set to. And it turns out, if they were off by tiny, tiny, tiny amounts, the universe would not be able to sustain life at all. Now, what do you do if atheism is your religion and suddenly there seemed to be this immaculate tuning in the way that the universe was set up that seems designed to enable life? Well, if there's gazillions of universes, then it's no longer surprising that we happen to be in a life-bearing universe, because with gazillions of them, the occasional one has to be life-bearing, and of course, we're in one of those. Well, what if we get to the end of the singularity and we find out that these dials are tuned even more immaculately than we ever suspected, and we also find out that there are no parallel universes? I think that would make people very spiritual. So it really depends on what we find out.
We've got 5-10 minutes left. So if you want to ask a question, just raise your hand and Rob will have a go at it.
The student asks whether I think the diffusion of attention that the internet has caused is a net positive or a net negative for interpersonal relations, and also asks what impact this might have on the prospects for world peace. It goes both ways. All of us now include far more people in the day-to-day community that we think about than ever was the case before. And they're also much more far-flung. We're connected to a much greater diversity of people and a higher number of people, and there's something inherently positive about that. But by spreading ourselves too thin, we're not as deep. I think what you said about global community has a really, really interesting potential. As we've grown up as a species, the circle of empathy that we have has generally expanded over the course of millennia. It used to be very, very clannish or very, very familial, and people who were outside of a tiny immediate community were essentially the enemy. And we grew up and we got better at communication and technology and got better at being kind toward one another. That group expanded to kingdom, to nation state. And ever increasingly, I think with a higher and higher percentage of humans, we believe that there's something sacred about all human life. That only increases as we start having deep and meaningful relationships from radically different societies. And that's something that the internet can already enable. I don't think it's really taken off in a meme-like way yet. I think that that's the kind of thing that makes stability much more likely and peace much more likely. But yeah, it does come at the cost of the deepest relationships that one can have. And I have a feeling this has been going on forever. I would imagine that people in the 1800s, let's say, probably had much deeper personal relations than we can imagine because they were exposed to a tinier group of people over their entire lifetimes. They didn't have any screens competing for attention. They didn't have any headphones distracting them when they were by themselves. So all they did was mull and decrypt these relationships. I think this has probably been going on for centuries. And yes, fire away. The question is about geoengineering, which is the very nascent science of essentially doing things to the atmosphere to reduce global warming without having to radically reduce our carbon emissions. We really don't know what's going to happen over the next 25 to 30 years, 50, 60 years. There are still variables and sensitivities that are unknowns. And so we could very well find ourselves with our backs against the wall with respect to climate change, and some very, very sophisticated exploratory research that could give us a ripcord that we can pull if the worst thing happens doesn't seem like a crazy investment to me. Now, there's two dangers with it. One danger is it might lead to a great deal of complacency. Just knowing that geoengineering research is starting to happen, and there will always be boosters and optimists out there who say, God, this is going to be so easy and so quick. And it might lead to significantly less rigor on the sustainability front. So that's danger number one. Danger number two is proliferation. It genuinely could be pretty damn easy. Again, I'm not an expert. I've dipped enough of a toe into the water to realize the thermostat may not be all that hard to mess with, given just a little bit of research and know-how. And if that research and know-how proliferates, as almost all research and know-how does, we might suddenly be in a situation where not just one, but 50 different people could grab the thermostat if they want to. And maybe not even nation states. Maybe billionaire philanthropists who think that they're doing a good thing. Or maybe evil mustache-twirling villains that are right out of a Bond movie, right? And when suddenly 50 or 100 people can jump on the thermostat, somebody's going to. And maybe 5 people will at once. And maybe the things that they do will have a synergistic effect, which is terrifying. So again, not an expert, but I do feel we owe it to ourselves to come up with an emergency plan, but I worry a great deal about proliferation.
Well, I think we're pretty close to it time, but I guess I want to end by saying it's easy to feel powerless against the machine. Geoengineering is a good example of that. If you want to see what heroic creative people are doing in the face of that, listening to Rob's podcast is a good start to see how people are taking action and being extraordinarily creative in the face of some of these challenges. There's another machine that we often feel powerless against. It's not the technological machine, but the political machine. And there's heroic creative action that can be taken there too. In fact, today's a day that you can take it. There's still time. So if you haven't voted, go out and vote. If you know a friend that hasn't voted, have him or her go out and vote. And please join me in thanking Rob Reed for coming to the University of Florida.
So that's it for now. I do hope you'll join me in March for the amazing lineup of guests that I've put together for you. And meanwhile, if you haven't listened to all of my episodes, there's quite an archive available to you, either at after-on.com or through your podcast player. Topics tackled in the other 41 episodes of the After On podcast include robotics, cryptocurrency, astronomy, drones, genomics, synthetic biology, neuroscience, consciousness, privacy and government hacking, and a whole lot more. If you're really daring, you might also want to consider browsing the archive of bonus material I have posted to this show's backers. Just go to my Patreon page, which is at patreon.com/RobReed, and Patreon is spelled Patreon, and my last name is Reid. Sign up and you'll get everything going back to February of 2018, all of that bonus content, and you won't be charged a thing until March. During these 2 quiet months, please, please, please also spread the word about this show, whether it's on social media or around the dinner table. The larger my audience is when I come back in March, the more likely it is that I'll be able to keep the show going indefinitely. And finally, an incredibly fast, simple, and free thing that anyone can do in a few seconds to give this show a meaningful boost is to rate it on the Apple Podcasts app, in Stitcher, or whatever podcast player you use. Ratings and reviews help drive discovery algorithms, which can determine which podcasts succeed and which ones fail. Thank you so much for joining me this year. Have a happy new year, and I do hope you'll join me again at the beginning of March.